In the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where golden crowns hide dark secrets and royal blood runs cold with ambition, a single discovery in a midnight blue carriage would shatter centuries of carefully constructed lies. What the royal guards found that fateful evening wasn't just evidence of betrayal. It was proof that the woman who had married into the most powerful family in the realm had been playing a game far more dangerous than anyone imagined. As palace bells chimed midnight, Prince Alexander stood in the marble corridors of Valdoria Castle, holding documents that would either destroy his family's legacy or finally reveal the truth that had been buried beneath layers of royal protocol and whispered rumors. The kingdom's future hung in the balance, and the woman they called Queen Consort Isabel was about to face the reckoning she had spent years avoiding. The autumn wind carried an unusual chill through the cobblestone courtyards of Valdoria Castle, as Captain Marcus Thorne completed his final patrol of the evening. 20 years of service to the royal family had taught him to notice when something felt wrong, and tonight every instinct screamed danger. The Queen Consort's carriage sat in the eastern courtyard, its ornate golden fixtures gleaming under the flickering torchlight, but it was the faint sound of rustling papers from within that caught his attention. Queen Consort Isabel had married King Edmund 3 years prior, bringing with her promises of alliance with the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. Her beauty and charm had won over the court, but Marcus had never shaken the feeling that something lurked beneath her perfect smile. Tonight, as he approached the carriage to ensure it was properly secured for the evening, he would discover just how right his instincts had been. The carriage door hung slightly ajar, unusual for someone as meticulous about appearances as the Queen Consort. Marcus approached cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. The royal family's safety was his responsibility, and any irregularity demanded investigation. As he drew closer, he could see papers scattered across the velvet seats, illuminated by the soft glow of a forgotten oil lamp. What he saw made his blood run cold. Maps of Valdoria's military outposts, detailed fortress layouts, and most damning of all, correspondence bearing the seal of Valdoria's greatest enemy, the Kingdom of Drakmor. The documents were written in Isabel's distinctive handwriting, her elegant script forming words that spelled treason against the very crown she had sworn to serve. Marcus's hands trembled as he gathered the evidence. Letters detailing Valdoria's defensive weaknesses, battle plans that had been shared in confidence with the Queen Consort, and most shocking of all, a detailed assassination plot targeting King Edmund himself. The woman who shared the king's bed, who had access to his most private thoughts and strategic discussions, had been systematically betraying everything he held sacred. The weight of discovery pressed heavily on Marcus's shoulders as he carefully collected every document. This wasn't just infidelity or court intrigue. This was espionage at the highest level. Isabel had positioned herself perfectly, using her marriage as cover for what appeared to be a sophisticated intelligence operation. The alliance with Astoria had been a lie, a convenient story to explain her presence and access to royal secrets. As Marcus made his way through the castle's winding corridors toward Prince Alexander's chambers, his mind raced with implications. The prince, heir to the throne and known for his unwavering sense of justice, would need to see this evidence immediately. The kingdom's security had been compromised from within, and every day that Isabel remained in the castle posed an existential threat to Valdoria. The castle felt different as Marcus climbed the stone steps to the royal quarters. Tapestries that had always depicted scenes of triumph now seemed to mock the current crisis. Portraits of previous monarchs stared down from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to judge the current generation for allowing such a breach of trust. The very foundations of the monarchy appeared shaken by what he carried in his leather satchel. Prince Alexander's chambers occupied the castle's highest tower, a strategic choice that reflected both his status and his preference for solitude. The prince was known throughout the kingdom for his intelligence, his military prowess, and his absolute loyalty to Valdoria. If anyone could navigate this crisis, it would be him. But Marcus knew that even Alexander's renowned composure would be tested by what he was about to learn. The prince's guards recognized Marcus immediately and allowed him passage without question. His reputation for discretion and loyalty was well established, and his grim expression suggested urgent business that couldn't wait until morning. As Marcus knocked on the heavy oak doors, He steeled himself for a conversation that would change everything. Prince Alexander opened the door himself, still dressed in his formal evening attire from the night's state dinner. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his green eyes showed the fatigue of another long day managing court politics and military affairs. At 28, Alexander carried himself with the dignity befitting his position, but Marcus could see the weight of responsibility etched in the lines around his eyes. "Captain Thorne," Alexander said, his voice carrying a note of concern. "It's quite late for an official visit. What brings you to my chambers at this hour?" Marcus glanced down the corridor to ensure they were alone before responding. "Your Highness, I've discovered something that requires your immediate attention. It concerns the Queen Consort, and I'm afraid the implications are severe." Alexander's expression shifted immediately from tired politeness to sharp alertness. He stepped aside, allowing Marcus to enter the chamber, and closed the door firmly behind them. The room was illuminated by several oil lamps, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with books, maps, and weapons that reflected Alexander's varied interests and responsibilities. "Show me," Alexander said simply, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with crises. Marcus opened his satchel and began laying the documents on Alexander's mahogany desk. As each piece of evidence was revealed, the prince's expression grew darker. The maps, the correspondence, the detailed intelligence reports. It all painted a picture of systematic betrayal that went to the very heart of the kingdom's security. "How long do you estimate this has been going on?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the magnitude of what he was seeing. "Based on the dates in these letters, I would say since shortly after her marriage to the king," Marcus replied, "possibly even before." This level of detail suggests long-term planning and preparation. Alexander studied a particular document that outlined Valdoria's naval defenses in unprecedented detail. "These are secrets that only someone with the highest level of access could obtain. She's been using her position as queen consort to gather intelligence for Drakmor." The implications were staggering. Every private conversation Isabel had shared with King Edmund, every state council meeting she had attended, every strategic discussion she had witnessed, all of it could have been reported back to Valdoria's enemies. The kingdom's defenses had been laid bare by someone they had trusted implicitly. "There's more, Your Highness," Marcus said grimly, pointing to a document that had been folded separately from the others. "This appears to be a timeline for something called Operation Crown Fall." Alexander unfolded the paper and read in silence, his face growing pale as he absorbed its contents. The document outlined a coordinated attack on Valdoria, timed to coincide with the kingdom's annual harvest festival, when defenses would be at their lowest. But most shocking of all was the final phase of the operation, the assassination of King Edmund during the festival's closing ceremony, when he would be most exposed to public view. "She's planning to kill my father," Alexander whispered, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire in the stone hearth. Both men understood that they were looking at evidence of the most profound betrayal in Valdoria's history. This wasn't just treason. It was a systematic plan to destroy the monarchy from within. "What are your orders, Your Highness?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread before him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had just seen his world fundamentally altered. "We need to move carefully. If Isabel suspects we know, she might accelerate her timeline or flee before we can stop her. But we also can't allow this to continue another day. Too much is at stake." The prince began pacing the room, his mind clearly working through the various implications and possible responses. "First, we need to secure these documents and ensure no copies exist. Second, we need to determine who else might be involved in this conspiracy. Operation this sophisticated couldn't be managed by one person alone." Marcus nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation they faced. "Should we inform the king immediately?" Alexander paused in his pacing, considering the question carefully. "Not yet. My father's judgment is complicated when it comes to Isabel. She's proven quite skilled at manipulation, and I need to present him with irrefutable evidence and a clear plan for moving forward. If we approach this wrong, we risk giving her an opportunity to destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses." The prince returned to his desk and began examining the documents more carefully, looking for any detail that might provide insight into the scope of the conspiracy or the identity of other collaborators. As he studied the papers, his expression grew increasingly grave. "Captain, I need you to place discreet surveillance on the Queen Consort immediately. I want to know everyone she meets with, every message she sends, and every move she makes. But this must be done without arousing her suspicion." "Of course, Your Highness. What about the king's security?" "Increase it immediately, but make it appear routine. Use the excuse of increased bandit activity in the countryside or concerns about the upcoming festival. My father must be protected, but we can't reveal what we know until we're ready to act." As the two men continued planning their response to the crisis, neither could have imagined how much more complicated the situation would become. The documents they had discovered were just the beginning of a web of deception that reached far beyond what they had initially suspected, and the confrontation that lay ahead would test not only their loyalty to the crown, but their ability to save the kingdom they had sworn to protect. Dawn broke over Valdoria Castle with an eerie stillness that seemed to mock the turmoil brewing within its ancient walls. Prince Alexander had not slept, instead spending the long hours until sunrise analyzing every document Captain Thorne had discovered, searching for clues that might reveal the full extent of the conspiracy threatening his kingdom. As golden sunlight streamed through the tall windows of his chamber, he made a decision that would set events in motion that could not be undone. The morning court session would proceed as normal, but Alexander had arranged for additional security measures that would appear routine to casual observers. What Isabel didn't know was that every move she made was now being watched by Alexander's most trusted operatives. Captain Thorne had worked through the night to position guards and servants loyal to the crown in strategic locations throughout the castle, creating an invisible net of surveillance around the Queen Consort. Isabel descended the grand staircase to the throne room with her usual grace, her emerald silk gown rustling softly against the marble steps. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elaborate style befitting her station, and her smile seemed warm and genuine as she greeted various courtiers and nobles. To anyone watching, she appeared to be the perfect royal consort, dignified, charming, and completely devoted to her adopted kingdom. But Alexander saw something different now that he knew the truth. He noticed how her green eyes seemed to catalog every detail of the room's occupants, how her conversations always seemed to steer toward topics related to military affairs or diplomatic relations, and how she positioned herself to overhear discussions between his father and the various ministers and advisors who sought the king's counsel throughout the morning. King Edmund, tall and distinguished, with silver threading through his dark hair, presided over the court with the natural authority of a man born to rule. At 52, he remained an impressive figure, his years of experience evident in the way he handled various petitions and disputes brought before him. Alexander watched his father with new eyes, noting how completely Edmund trusted his wife, how he would often glance to her for silent approval or support during particularly difficult decisions. The morning session included discussions about troop movements along the eastern border, preparations for the upcoming harvest festival, and negotiations with various trading partners. Alexander realized with growing horror that Isabel was present for all of it, absorbing information that could prove vital to Valdoria's enemies. Every strategic detail, every defensive weakness discussed, every diplomatic confidence shared, all of it potentially compromised. During a brief recess, Alexander approached his father with carefully measured casualness. "Father, might I speak with you privately about the security arrangements for the festival?" King Edmund nodded, excusing himself from a conversation with the Minister of Trade. As they walked toward a smaller chamber adjacent to the throne room, Alexander noticed Isabel watching them with what seemed like casual interest, but he now recognized it as something more calculating. "What concerns do you have about the festival's security?" Edmund asked once they were alone. Alexander had prepared for this moment carefully. "I've received reports of increased activity by Drakmor agents in the surrounding kingdoms. I believe we should consider additional precautions, particularly given the public nature of the festival events." It wasn't entirely a lie. Drakmor had indeed been more active in recent months, though Alexander now understood this was likely connected to the operation Isabel was coordinating. He watched his father's reaction carefully, noting how Edmund's expression grew serious. "What kind of additional precautions do you recommend?" Edmund asked. increased patrols, additional guards for public events, and perhaps limiting access to certain areas of the castle during the festival. I'd also like to review the guest list for the closing ceremony. Edmund considered this carefully. These seem like reasonable measures. Has Captain Thorne identified any specific threats? Alexander chose his words carefully. He's investigating several concerning reports. I believe it would be prudent to implement these measures while his investigation continues. As they discussed the security arrangements, Alexander found himself studying his father's face for any sign that Edmund suspected the truth about his wife. But the king's trust in Isabel appeared absolute, which made Alexander's task even more difficult. How could he convince his father that the woman he loved was planning to betray and possibly kill him? When they returned to the throne room, Isabel approached them with her characteristic warmth. You both look very serious. I hope there's nothing troubling the kingdom? Just routine security preparations for the festival, Edmund replied, his hand finding hers in a gesture of casual affection that made Alexander's stomach turn. Alexander is being appropriately cautious. Of course, Isabel said, her smile never wavering. We can't be too careful with so many visitors expected for the celebration. Alexander watched her closely, searching for any sign of deception or concern. But Isabel's performance was flawless. She appeared genuinely interested in the kingdom's welfare and completely devoted to her husband's safety. If Alexander hadn't seen the evidence with his own eyes, he might have believed the act himself. The remainder of the morning session passed without incident, but Alexander noticed several troubling details that confirmed his worst fears. When a messenger arrived with reports from the border patrol, Isabel listened intently to discussions about troop positions and defensive strategies. When the Minister of Defense mentioned concerns about supply lines, she asked seemingly innocent questions that would provide valuable intelligence to enemy forces. Most disturbing of all was a moment when Isabel excused herself briefly from the throne room, claiming a need to speak with the castle's head of household about festival preparations. Alexander discreetly signaled to one of his surveillance operatives, who followed at a distance and reported back that she had actually met with a servant in a secluded alcove, passing him what appeared to be a small rolled paper before returning to her duties. By midday, Alexander had seen enough to confirm that the documents found in Isabel's carriage were just one part of a much larger intelligence operation. She was actively gathering information and had established a network of contacts within the castle who were helping her transmit secrets to Drakmor. The scope of the betrayal was even worse than he had initially feared. Captain Thorne approached Alexander during the lunch recess with updates from the surveillance operation. Your Highness, we've identified at least 3 castle servants who appear to be part of her network. The cook's assistant, a stable hand, and surprisingly, one of the king's personal valets. The revelation about the valet hit Alexander like a physical blow. This person had access to the king's private chambers, his personal schedule, and his most intimate routines. If Isabel had compromised someone that close to Edmund, the assassination plot became infinitely more feasible. How long has the valet been in service? Alexander asked. About 2 years. He was recommended for the position by the queen consort herself. Of course he was. Alexander realized that Isabel had been planning this operation for far longer than they had initially suspected. She hadn't just taken advantage of opportunities as they arose, she had systematically placed her own people in key positions throughout the castle's hierarchy. Captain, I need you to arrange for the valet to be discreetly reassigned to duties that don't involve direct access to my father. Create a believable excuse, perhaps an opportunity for advancement in another department. We can't risk alerting the network, but we must limit their access to the king. Understood. What about the other compromised servants? Keep them under surveillance, but don't move against them yet. They might lead us to other members of the network we haven't identified. But make sure none of them have access to sensitive information about our security preparations. As the afternoon court session began, Alexander found himself watching the familiar routines of royal life with new understanding. Every conversation, every casual interaction, every moment of apparent normalcy was potentially part of Isabel's intelligence-gathering operation. The castle that had been his home for his entire life now felt like enemy territory, with threats lurking behind every smile and danger hidden in every shadow. The afternoon brought a delegation from a neighboring kingdom, requiring Edmund and Isabel to participate in formal diplomatic discussions. Alexander observed the proceedings with growing unease, watching as Isabel charmed the foreign delegates while simultaneously gathering information about their military capabilities and political intentions. Her skill at extracting intelligence through seemingly casual conversation was remarkable and deeply disturbing. As evening approached, Alexander realized that he was facing a crisis unlike anything Valdoria had ever confronted. The enemy wasn't at the gates. The enemy was sleeping in the royal chambers, sitting beside the king at state dinners, and participating in the most sensitive discussions about the kingdom's security. Every day they delayed action. More secrets were compromised and the danger to Edmund grew greater. But Alexander also understood that moving too quickly could be catastrophic. If they acted without sufficient evidence or proper preparation, Isabel might escape justice, or worse, accelerate her timeline for the assassination attempt. The prince found himself walking a dangerous tightrope, trying to protect his father while gathering the evidence needed to convince Edmund of his wife's true nature. As night fell over the castle, Alexander made his way to his chambers with a heavy heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and more difficult decisions. He had identified the enemy and understood the scope of the threat, but the most difficult part lay ahead, confronting Isabel directly and forcing her to account for her crimes against the crown. The documents spread across his desk seemed to mock him with their implications. Maps, letters, assassination plans, all written in the elegant hand of a woman his father loved and trusted completely. Alexander knew that revealing this evidence would shatter his father's heart, but failing to act would cost Edmund his life and the kingdom its future. As he prepared for another sleepless night, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The harvest festival was only days away, and if the timeline outlined in Isabel's documents was accurate, they had very little time left to prevent a catastrophe that would change Valdoria forever. Tomorrow, he would have to begin the most difficult confrontation of his life, knowing that the stakes could not be higher, and the margin for error did not exist. The third day of Alexander's investigation dawned gray and foreboding, with heavy clouds promising rain that would mirror the storm brewing within the castle walls. Alexander had spent the night formulating a plan that would force Isabel to reveal more about her network, while giving him the evidence he needed to convince his father of her treachery. It was a dangerous game, but time was running short, and desperate measures were becoming necessary. Captain Thorne arrived at Alexander's chambers before sunrise with disturbing new intelligence. During the night watch, guards had observed Isabel leaving her private quarters and meeting with an unknown figure in the castle gardens. The meeting had lasted only minutes, but they had exchanged what appeared to be documents before the mysterious visitor disappeared over the garden wall. "Did you get a clear look at this person?" Alexander asked, studying the captain's report. "Unfortunately, no. They were dressed in dark clothing and kept to the shadows. But based on their movement patterns and build, I believe it was a professional, someone trained in stealth and covert operations." This confirmed Alexander's worst fears. Isabel wasn't working alone or simply passing information to Drakmor through intermediaries. She was in direct contact with enemy operatives who had infiltrated the very heart of Valdoria. The security breach was far worse than anyone had imagined. "Captain, I want you to organize a special meeting for this evening. Tell the king and queen consort that you've received intelligence about a potential threat to the festival, and that you need to brief them on enhanced security measures. Make it seem routine, but ensure the meeting takes place in the map room." The map room was a strategic choice. Its walls were lined with detailed charts of Valdoria's defenses, trade routes, and military installations, exactly the kind of information that would be invaluable to enemy spies. If Isabel was indeed working for Drakmor, she wouldn't be able to resist the opportunity to gather additional intelligence, even if it meant taking risks. "What do you plan to accomplish with this meeting, Your Highness?" Thorne asked. "I'm going to give her enough rope to hang herself," Alexander replied grimly. "But first, I need to ensure my father's safety. I want you to have guards positioned outside every entrance to the map room, and I want our most trusted men watching from concealed positions inside. If this goes wrong, we need to be able to protect the king immediately." As the day progressed, Alexander continued his careful observation of Isabel's activities. She maintained her perfect facade throughout the morning court session, but he noticed subtle signs of tension that hadn't been present before. Her smile seemed slightly forced, her attention appeared divided, and she seemed to be watching the castle's comings and goings more carefully than usual. The surveillance team reported that she had made several attempts to access areas of the castle that were normally off-limits to her, claiming various excuses related to festival preparations. When denied access to the armory, she had seemed particularly frustrated, though she had covered her disappointment quickly with gracious acceptance. More troubling still were reports that several of the compromised servants had been unusually active throughout the day. The cook's assistant had been seen in corridors far from the kitchen. The stable hand had asked unusual questions about guard rotations, and despite Alexander's attempts to reassign him, the valet had somehow managed to maintain his access to areas near the king's private chambers. As evening approached, Alexander felt the weight of impending confrontation settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Everything he had worked for, everything he believed in, would be put to the test in the coming hours. If his plan succeeded, he would expose a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of the kingdom. If it failed, he might not live to see another sunrise. The map room was illuminated by dozens of candles when King Edmund and Queen Consort Isabel arrived for the security briefing. Alexander stood beside a large table covered with charts and documents, while Captain Thorne waited near the door. The hidden guards were in position, though their presence was undetectable to casual observation. "Thank you both for coming," Alexander began, his voice steady despite the tension coursing through his body. "Captain Thorne has received intelligence that requires immediate attention." Thorne stepped forward, playing his role perfectly. "Your Majesties, our sources have reported unusual Drakmor activity along our eastern borders. We believe they may be planning some kind of action during the Harvest Festival." Alexander watched Isabel carefully as Thorne spoke, noting how her eyes immediately focused on the map spread across the table. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze cataloging the defensive positions and troop deployments marked on the charts. "What kind of action are we talking about?" Edmund asked, his concern evident. "We're not certain, Your Majesty," Alexander replied, spreading out additional maps that showed Valdoria's most sensitive military installations. "But these documents outline their known capabilities and possible targets." As he spoke, Alexander deliberately placed several pieces of false information among the genuine intelligence reports, fictional troop movements, non-existent supply routes, and fabricated defensive positions. If Isabel was truly working for Drakmor, these false details would eventually make their way to enemy commanders, confirming her guilt beyond any doubt. Isabel studied the materials with what appeared to be appropriate concern for the kingdom's safety. But Alexander noticed how her eyes lingered on specific details that would be most valuable to enemy strategists. When he pointed out a supply convoy route, her attention sharpened noticeably. When he mentioned defensive weaknesses at certain border posts, she leaned in closer to examine the maps. "Perhaps we should cancel the public portions of the festival," Isabel suggested, her voice carrying just the right note of worried concern. "The safety of our people must come first." It was a masterful performance, but Alexander recognized it for what it was, an attempt to create exactly the kind of chaos and disruption that would benefit Drakmor's plans. Canceling the festival would damage morale, suggest weakness to potential allies, and possibly create the very crisis that enemy forces were hoping to exploit. "I don't think that will be necessary," Edmund replied firmly. "We won't allow threats to dictate our actions or deprive our people of their celebration. We'll simply take additional precautions." Alexander watched Isabel's reaction to his father's decision. For just a moment, her mask slipped and he saw something calculating and cold flash across her features before her expression returned to one of loving concern for her husband's safety. "Of course you're right," she said, reaching out to touch Edmund's arm affectionately. "I just worry about the risks involved in maintaining such a public schedule." As the briefing continued, Alexander shared more detailed information about security preparations, deliberately including several elements that he knew would be tempting targets for intelligence gathering. He mentioned guard rotations, escape routes, and communication protocols, all modified with false details that would help identify the source of any leaks. Captain Thorne will coordinate with the festival organizers to implement these additional measures, Alexander concluded. "We'll maintain normal appearances while strengthening our actual defenses." As the meeting ended and his parents prepared to leave, Alexander noticed Isabel lingering near the table, her eyes making one final sweep of the maps and documents. It was a subtle gesture, lasting only seconds, but it confirmed everything he had suspected about her true intentions. After Edmund and Isabel had left the map room, Alexander remained behind with Captain Thorne to review what they had observed. The trap had been set, and now they would need to wait for Isabel to act on the information she had gathered. "How long do you think it will take for her to make contact with her handlers?" Thorne asked. "Not long," Alexander replied. "The intelligence we shared tonight was too valuable for her to sit on. She'll need to pass it along quickly, especially given the proximity of the festival." They didn't have to wait long for confirmation. Less than 2 hours after the meeting had ended, surveillance teams reported that Isabel had left her chambers and was moving through the castle's lower levels toward the gardens. This time, Alexander and a small team of his most trusted guards followed at a distance, determined to identify her contact and gather evidence of the treasonous communication. The night was dark and moonless, providing perfect cover for covert activities. Alexander watched from a concealed position as Isabel made her way to a secluded area of the garden where ancient oak trees created deep shadows. Within minutes, a figure emerged from the darkness, the same mysterious operative who had met with her the previous night. This time, Alexander was close enough to observe the exchange in detail. Documents changed hands, but more importantly, he could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the still night air. Words like timeline, access routes, and, most damning of all, the king's schedule confirmed that they were discussing the assassination plot outlined in the documents found in her carriage. Alexander's blood ran cold as he heard Isabel say, "The closing ceremony will provide the perfect opportunity. Security will be focused on crowd control, and his position on the platform will leave him exposed." The mysterious figure nodded and replied, "Our people will be in position. The signal will be the release of the ceremonial doves. When they take flight, we strike." As the two conspirators concluded their meeting and prepared to part ways, Alexander made a decision that would bring the crisis to its inevitable conclusion. He had the evidence he needed to prove Isabel's guilt beyond any doubt, and he had learned enough about the assassination plot to prevent it from succeeding. The time for surveillance and investigation had ended. Tomorrow, he would confront Isabel directly and force her to face the consequences of her betrayal. But as he watched the enemy operative disappear into the night and Isabel return to the castle, Alexander realized that the most difficult part of his ordeal still lay ahead. He would need to shatter his father's trust, expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the court, and somehow maintain the stability of the kingdom while rooting out all of Isabel's collaborators. The Harvest Festival was only 2 days away, and Alexander knew that everything he had worked for, everything his family had built over generations, would be decided in the confrontation that was now inevitable. As he made his way back to his chambers, he steeled himself for a battle that would test not only his courage, but his ability to save both his father's life and his kingdom's future. The morning of the confrontation arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that often precedes momentous events. Alexander had spent the pre-dawn hours in final preparation, reviewing every piece of evidence and planning for every possible outcome. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders, as he realized that within hours, he would either save his kingdom or watch it fall to an enemy who had already breached its most sacred defenses. Captain Thorne arrived with the final pieces of intelligence that would seal Isabel's fate. Overnight surveillance had captured her making additional contacts with servants and castle staff, confirming the scope of the network she had built within Valdoria's walls. More damning still was evidence that she had attempted to access the royal treasury records and the castle's architectural plans, information that would be crucial for coordinating the assassination attempt during the festival. The enemy operative she met with last night was identified leaving the kingdom through the Eastern Pass, Thorne reported. Our border guards found correspondence on him that confirms Drakmore's invasion plans. The assassination is just the beginning. They're planning a full-scale assault to coincide with the chaos following the king's death. Alexander studied the intercepted documents with growing alarm. The plot was far more comprehensive than anyone had imagined. Drakmore forces were already positioned along multiple borders, waiting for the signal to begin a coordinated attack that would overwhelm Valdoria's defenses while the kingdom reeled from the loss of its monarch. Isabel hadn't just been gathering intelligence. She had been orchestrating the complete destruction of everything Alexander held dear. "How many of our own people are involved in this conspiracy?" Alexander asked. "We've identified at least 12 castle staff members who appear to be compromised," Thorne replied grimly. "But given the sophistication of the operation, there are likely others we haven't detected yet." The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Isabel had spent 3 years systematically corrupting loyal servants, planting her own agents in key positions and mapping every weakness in Valdoria's defenses. She had turned the castle itself into a weapon aimed at the heart of the monarchy. Alexander made his final decision: gather our most trusted guards and position them throughout the throne room. "I'm going to confront Isabel during this morning's court session, in front of the assembled nobles and ministers. The evidence needs to be presented publicly, so there can be no question about her guilt." "Are you certain that's wise, Your Highness? A public confrontation could create panic and might give her accomplices an opportunity to act." "The time for discretion has passed," Alexander replied firmly. "If we don't expose this conspiracy now, we'll lose our last chance to prevent the assassination. Besides, a public revelation will make it harder for any remaining conspirators to deny their involvement or escape justice." As the morning court session began, Alexander took his position beside his father's throne with an outward appearance of calm that belied the turmoil in his heart. He watched Isabel enter the throne room with her characteristic grace, noting how she surveyed the assembled crowd with what he now recognized as tactical assessment rather than social awareness. The routine business of court proceeded normally for the first hour. Petitions were heard, minor disputes were resolved, and various ministers reported on preparations for the upcoming harvest festival. But Alexander noticed that Isabel seemed more tense than usual. Her responses to questions slightly delayed, and her smiles not quite reaching her eyes. When King Edmund called for a brief recess, Alexander knew the moment had arrived. He stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the throne room. "Father, before we continue with the morning's business, I have a matter of urgent importance that requires the attention of the court." Edmund looked surprised but nodded for his son to proceed. The assembled nobles and ministers turned their attention to Alexander, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. "3 nights ago," Alexander began, his voice steady and clear, "evidence was discovered that reveals a conspiracy against the crown that reaches to the very heart of our kingdom." A murmur of shock and concern rippled through the throne room. Isabel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but Alexander caught the flash of calculation in her eyes as she realized what was happening. Alexander nodded to Captain Thorne, who stepped forward carrying a leather portfolio containing the evidence they had gathered. "Captain Thorne will present the details of what we have discovered." As Thorne began laying out the documents on a table before the throne, describing how they had been found in Isabel's carriage and what they revealed about her true allegiances, Alexander watched his stepmother's reaction carefully. She maintained her composure remarkably well, but he could see the wheels turning as she calculated her options and prepared her response. "These are serious accusations," Isabel said when Thorne had finished his presentation. Her voice carried just the right note of shock and indignation. "I can only assume that these documents were planted in my carriage by someone seeking to discredit me." It was exactly the response Alexander had expected, a combination of denial and victimization that had served her well in the past. But this time, he was prepared with evidence that would be impossible to dismiss. "Captain Thorne," Alexander said, "please share with the court what our surveillance teams observed over the past 3 nights." Thorne proceeded to describe Isabel's midnight meetings with enemy operatives, her attempts to access restricted areas of the castle, and the network of compromised servants she had been coordinating. With each revelation, the evidence of her guilt became more overwhelming. King Edmund, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke. "Isabel, how do you explain these observations?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Isabel's mask began to slip. Alexander could see her calculating whether continued denial was viable or whether she needed to shift to a different strategy. "Edmund," she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone, "you know me. You know my devotion to you and to this kingdom. Surely you don't believe I could be capable of such betrayal." But Alexander was ready for this as well. He nodded to Thorne, who produced the final piece of evidence, a detailed confession written in Isabel's own handwriting that had been discovered during a search of her private chambers that morning. This document, Alexander announced, outlines the complete scope of the conspiracy, including specific details about the planned assassination during tomorrow's festival closing ceremony. The throne room erupted in gasps and exclamations of shock as the implications became clear. Several nobles called for Isabel's immediate arrest, while others demanded to know how such a conspiracy could have proceeded undetected for so long. Isabel, realizing that her position had become untenable, made one final gambit. "Even if these documents are genuine," she said, her voice taking on a harder edge, "you're already too late to stop what's been set in motion. Drakmor forces are already in position, and my death won't prevent them from achieving their objectives." It was a confession wrapped in a threat, but it also revealed something crucial. The invasion would proceed with or without the assassination, meaning that Valdoria faced an even greater crisis than Alexander had realized. King Edmund rose from his throne, his face pale with shock and betrayal. For a moment, he looked older than his years, the weight of his wife's treachery visible in every line of his face. "Guards," he said, his voice heavy with pain and authority, "place the queen consort under arrest for high treason against the crown." As the guards moved to detain Isabel, she made one last desperate attempt to escape, but Alexander had anticipated this possibility, and additional guards were positioned to block every exit. Within moments, she was in custody, her 3-year deception finally at an end. But even as Isabel was led away in chains, Alexander knew that the crisis was far from over. The assassination plot had been prevented, but Drakmor forces were still positioned to invade, and there were still enemy agents within the castle who needed to be identified and captured. "Captain Thorne," Alexander commanded, "implement the emergency protocols we discussed. All castle staff are to be questioned. The festival is to be postponed indefinitely, and our military commanders are to be notified immediately of the invasion threat." As orders flew and the throne room emptied of all but the most essential personnel, Alexander found himself alone with his father for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "How long have you known?" Edmund asked quietly. 3 days, Alexander replied. "I wanted to be certain of the evidence before bringing it to your attention." Edmund nodded slowly, understanding the impossible position his son had been placed in. "You saved my life, and quite possibly the kingdom. I know this couldn't have been easy." Alexander looked at his father, seeing the pain in his eyes and understanding that the betrayal had wounded him in ways that might never fully heal. "I'm sorry, father. I know you cared for her." "I loved her," Edmund said simply. "But the crown must always come before personal feelings. You understand that better than I did." Over the following hours, as the security sweep continued and the full scope of Isabel's network was revealed, Alexander coordinated the kingdom's response to the impending invasion. Messages were sent to allied kingdoms requesting assistance, reserves were called up, and defensive positions were strengthened. The harvest festival was indeed postponed, but rather than dampening spirits, the revelation of the conspiracy and its prevention actually strengthened the kingdom's resolve. Citizens rallied to support their monarch, and neighboring kingdoms that had been uncertain about their loyalties declared their firm support for Valdoria against the Drakmor threat. In the end, when Drakmor forces did attempt their invasion 2 days later, they found Valdoria prepared and united rather than weakened and divided. The conspiracy that had been intended to destroy the kingdom had instead revealed its strength and the loyalty of its people. Alexander stood beside his father on the castle's highest tower as they watched enemy forces retreating across the border, their invasion attempt having failed completely. The crisis had passed, but the lessons learned would shape Valdoria's approach to security and diplomacy for generations to come. "The kingdom is stronger for having survived this test," Edmund observed, "and wiser for understanding how close we came to losing everything," Alexander replied. As the sun set over Valdoria, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Alexander reflected on the events that had nearly destroyed his homeland. The betrayal had been profound and the danger immense, but it had also revealed the strength of character and loyalty that remained at the heart of the kingdom. Isabel's conspiracy had failed not just because it had been discovered, but because the values she had tried to corrupt, honor, duty, and love of country, had proven stronger than her deception. The Valderan scandal was over, but its impact would be felt for years to come, serving as both a warning about the dangers of complacency and a testament to the power of courage, loyalty, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of what matters most.